War is all about many large and small battles that are conducted simultaneously. Moreover, in hybrid war conditions, the diplomatic front, the information field, and the economic sphere are also platforms for conducting a major battlefield. But without the brute force that the army demonstrates, all these non-military means of warfare totally lose their meaning. For as long as the infantry holds its position, for as long as artillery launches shell after shell against the enemy, and for as long as there is fuel, ammunition and soldiers, a state exists and continues to fight to the bitter end. But if the army fails to fulfill its assigned task, no diplomat, businessman or eloquent speaker would be able to oppose the brute force of the enemy troops.
Не хочу об этом разговаривать.
Immediately, forgetting about contracts and promises, the aggressor will come knocking on the door and take anything they want as the stronger side. This is the 48th episode of the series History of the War. In 2014, the Russian Federation committed an act of armed aggression against Ukraine. The war has been going on for several years now. Hot on the heels, we're following the course of this war, tracing the links between military operations, diplomacy, politics and economics. We're trying to understand how it all happened and, most importantly, why. While preparing for the final assault, the Russian terrorist forces amassed all the potentially available forces on the outskirts of Debaltseve. By exposing the second-degree directions, the strategists of the Kremlin aimed to launch the final onslaught against the Ukrainian army with an attempt to crush it once and for all. By the morning of February 18th, a garrison of 300 militants, 2 Hrad multiple-launch rocket systems, and 1 mortar battery remained in the occupied city of Stakhanov. The rest of the forces were then immediately redeployed to Debaltseve. 11 tanks and 5 infantry fighting vehicles moved from Horlivka to the area north of Vuhlegirsk. 4 tanks, 2 Zu-23 autocannons, 3 D-3 howitzers, and 300 militants arrived in Yanakievo. In total, the high command of the militants issued about 25 tanks, 35 various armored vehicles, more than 40 units of barreled artillery, and 12 MLRS for the assault. We should also not forget about the reinforcement forces from Russia, which were deployed in the combat zone in eastern Ukraine, both along highways and by rail. It is also worth noting that the movement of these troops was very closely tracked by reconnaissance units and pro-Ukrainian local residents. Whenever there was a possibility, the Ukrainian military opened fire against these convoys of the enemy forces. It is known for certain that on February 13, 2015, during the unloading in the city of Ilovaisk, a military train transporting soldiers and vehicles was destroyed by Tochka-U missiles. The ignition of fuel tanks and detonation of ammunition led to the death of roughly 100 Russian artillerists. A similar situation occurred in the direction of Mariupol, where on February 16, 2015, an ammunition depot suffered a major strike. This attack resulted in the deaths of 8 Russian soldiers and the injury of 22 Russian soldiers. In both cases, troops of the Russian 268th Artillery Brigade suffered losses. The soldiers of the unit completely lost their combat capability and were withdrawn back to the Russian territory. The unexpected losses basically in the rear ruined the grandiose plans of Russian commanders, thus forcing them to improvise. These circumstances explain the certain weakening of the onslaught of hybrid troops on February 16th and 17th, as well as the hasty relocation of additional forces to Debaltseve. The Russian terrorist forces did not manage to amass a sufficient number of soldiers on time to destroy the forces of the Ukrainian Debaltseve group. But on the night of February 18th, 2015, Ukrainian troops left their positions near the city of Debaltseve and fought their way through into the Bakhmut area. The army of Ukraine suffered relatively low losses and preserved its combat capability. Despite all the effort of the Kremlin strategists, they did not manage to organize a crushing defeat similar to the one that was achieved in Ilovaisk. The fact is that the Russian terrorist forces did not fulfill the main task of neutralizing the Ukrainian forces. In the afternoon, the militants entered the deserted city. Carefully setting up the stage, Russian journalists filmed the damaged vehicles and bodies of Ukrainian soldiers that could not be evacuated. The destruction of the city caused by Russian artillery was completely left out of the frame. Formally, the Ukrainian army lost the battle for Debaltseve, and the battlefield was left for the enemy. But the Kremlin's hybrid army suffered excessive losses. Russian commanders had to cancel their plans for further advance into Ukraine. On the other hand, Ukraine managed to save its soldiers, won a number of battles, and continued resistance on all fronts right to the bloody end. The units that were the last to leave Debaltseve were heavily shelled and suffered severe casualties. According to the original plan, they were forced to abandon defective vehicles and some of their ammunition. Over the next several days, separate groups of soldiers continued to return to the Ukrainian positions on foot. Special forces organized a search for those that were missing in action. Despite all the efforts of the special forces, 13 soldiers had been taken into captivity. There was a nuance of an informational nature worth noting. Journalists who met military convoys from Debaltseve in the morning filmed the vehicles and interviewed rank-and-file soldiers. Many soldiers, without agreeing to give comments in advance, described the catastrophic defeat of the Ukrainian troops and major losses. At the same time, the official version of events was the opposite of the statements made by these soldiers reporting the successful withdrawal of the troops.
Поставлені завдання Збройні сили України виконали повністю.
There is a simple explanation for the different reports. Taking advantage of the surprise factor, a sufficiently large number of Ukrainian troops left Debaltseve during the night. The Russian terrorist forces who were engaged in planning their assault on the city simply did not manage to respond to the actions of the Ukrainian army in time. Initially, the opposition was rather weak. But the last convoys that left the next morning had to fight their way through to the freedom.
Под обстрілом, но вийшли.
Those units that left as part of the last convoy suffered the greatest losses.
Вышли с боем. Многие, наверное, погибли, ранены.
Having broken through minefields and artillery fire, the soldiers sincerely and openly described what they saw to journalists, and the media aired it all, forgetting that soldiers always judge by their own intuition. Indeed, the fact is that if they take part in a difficult battle, then they inadvertently think that the entire army of soldiers also went through the same hell. The second aspect of the information war was that many Russian political experts started analyzing the reports on the retreat of Ukrainian soldiers from Debaltseve. Studying the photos and videos, they focused the attention of the viewing audience on the fact that the footage showed a pathetically small number of vehicles. Combining this information with statements about the rich trophies of the militants, Kremlin propagandists sought to create a myth about the complete defeat of the Ukrainian army. But in reality, everything was much more complicated. A part of the troops immediately took defensive positions along the Svitlodarsk, Luhansk and Mironivsky line. Subsequently, this part of the front would be named the Svitlodarsk Arc for its characteristic shape. A part of the Debaltseve group made its way to Bakhmut during the night, where the process of restoring the combat readiness of the soldiers began. The last units of the military forces crossed the new front line later in the afternoon. Meeting this part of the troops, which suffered the greatest losses in battles, is featured in many reports. The enemy was unable to pursue the retreating Ukrainian troops. There were no reasons for a rapid breakthrough to Bakhmut. The Kremlin's hybrid army occupied the half-ruined city of Debaltseve without a fight. Using its powerful propaganda machine, the Russian side once again began creating the illusion of having achieved a resounding victory. On the same day, fighting continued in Shirokina. The terrorists occupied a multi-story building in the village and, adjusting the fire from there, shelled Ukrainian troops with mortars. 2 hours later, it became possible to draw the Russian mercenaries from their positions. Under the cover of 2 tanks, the militants retreated to the northeast, towards Sahanka. As a result of the battle, 1 enemy tank was hit, but was then towed away to safety. In total, 24 Ukrainian soldiers were killed on February 18th. The next day, the intensity of the fighting decreased, although it was not completely silent. Terrorists periodically fired small arms and mortars at Ukrainian positions. Near Donetsk, in the area of Pisky and Opitne, there were several engagements with the enemy and 2 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. On February 20th, official information was published on the battles in Debaltseve, as well as information about the losses of the enemy. Advisor to the President of Ukraine, Yuri Byrykov, announced that over the period of January 18th to February 18th in 2015, the losses of the Ukrainian army amounted to 179 soldiers killed in action, 110 were captured, and 81 soldiers were reported missing in action. According to intercepted radio transmissions and the reports of intelligence services, the losses of the militants amounted to 2,911 people, 868 of whom died in the last 3 days of fighting for the city. In total, the enemy sent 15,000 to 17,000 soldiers, a third of which were professional Russian military personnel, against the 3,000-strong Ukrainian grouping. A new line of defense was being put up near Shirokine. It is important to note that the village itself is located in lowlands, which means it is not a very wise move to send troops into a settlement without control over adjacent heights. Mayak was the main Ukrainian position in Shirokine, located on a hill in the western part of the village, where the militants controlled the eastern outskirts. Shirokine turned into an arena for a street battle for several months. In addition to small arms, mortars and tanks were being used in combat. On February 20th, a local resident was killed in a shelling. In total, as a result of shelling of the towns of Avdiivka, Kurakhivka, and the villages of Luhansk and Verkhnetorets, 6 civilians were killed. On February 21st, a recon group of the 79th Brigade was ambushed in Shirokine, and 1 soldier was killed. The group held a perimeter defense for the whole day, but it was eventually unblocked. On the same day, as a result of a special operation, a soldier of the 3rd Special Forces Regiment who was wounded and captured by the militants on February 16th was freed from captivity. On February 22, 2015, the war once again hit the city of Kharkiv. During the march dedicated to the anniversary of the events of Euromaidan, there was an explosion. By a fortunate coincidence, the fragments hit a passing vehicle, thanks to which the number of victims was lower. Then an improvised explosive device containing the equivalent of 2 kilograms of TNT killed 2 people right on the spot, and 11 more innocent bystanders sustained serious injuries. 2 of the victims died later in a local hospital. 4 days after the attack, the terrorists were detained. As it turned out, the terrorists were trained in Russia. It is important to understand that this attack was part of a plan of a greater scale. With the intention of crushing the Ukrainian army in Debaltseve, the Kremlin was planning to destabilize the situation in Kharkiv. The organization of street riots, with subsequent alleged peacekeeping operations, was the classic signature style of the Russian special services. Then everything is done according to a proven scheme. An uprising, another People's Republic, allegedly seized weapons and local self-defense fighters with Russian passports. If the Ukrainian troops were defeated by that time, then there would have been no way to stop the hybrid invasion of Russian troops and terrorists. Indeed, the fact is that the Russian authorities had planned to cut off at least one more region from Ukraine with counterattacks from the north and south. But there's no place for a subjunctive mood in history. Debaltseve became a kind of Thermopylae for Ukraine. The situation was much more dangerous than during the summer campaign, but at the end of February 2015, very few people could have even thought that this would be the case. Russian propaganda was intended to present a Pyrrhic victory as a graceful military operation, but in reality it turned out somewhat different. The Ukrainian army was strongly holding a new line of defense in the area of Svetlodarsk, Luhansk and Mironivsky. Then the front line was leveled off and the intensity of fighting decreased significantly. As a result, the warfare assumed a positional nature. Despite this, the war is still ongoing.